This is the world at the center of the world. This is the city that was born from a lake, Tenochtitlan, a jewel of stone and water, built on mud and reeds, held together by the iron will of a people. In the days of its greatest splendor, it was one of the mightiest cities humanity had ever seen. Towers and pyramids rose into the clear sky of the high valley. Canals crossed the metropolis like silver veins. Thousands of canoes glided across the water, loaded with the riches of an empire. In the heart of the city rose the great temple, the Templo Mayor, an artificial mountain axis that connected the levels of existence. Two shrines crowned its summit. One was dedicated to Tlaloc, Lord of Rain and Sustenance. The other belonged to Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, the relentless god of the sun and war. Here, on this consecrated height, priests with black painted bodies and long hair, matted with blood, looked up toward the sky. They were the guardians of time, the servants of the gods. Their task was to preserve the balance of the cosmos. That balance was fragile. It hung from a thread of blood. The gods, the Mexica believed, had sacrificed themselves to create the present world, the fifth sun. Now they demanded nourishment. They hungered for the most precious liquid that human beings possessed. Chalchihuat, the precious water, human blood. On the sacrificial stone, before the shrine of Huitzilopochtli, lay the captives. They were warriors captured in ritual battles in order to fulfill this moment. 4 priests held their limbs firmly while a 5th raised the obsidian knife. The blade was sharper than steel, struck from volcanic glass that was considered sacred. With precise force, the priest cut through the chest. He reached into the opening and tore out the still-beating heart. This heart was offered to the sun, to the god, who needed its strength in order to appear again on the horizon every morning. The victim's body was pushed down the steps of the pyramid, a cascade of red color across the painted stone. Below, the people waited. They watched as the gods were fed. They watched as their world was saved from destruction. This was not an act of cruelty for its own sake. It was a necessity. It was the sacred duty of a people who saw themselves as chosen to keep the sun alive. They were the Aztecs, the people of the Mexica. They had risen from nothing to rule an empire that stretched from ocean to ocean. Their power rested on 2 pillars: the unshakable faith in their gods and the merciless strength of their warriors. Every day, smoke rose from the temples. Every day, blood flowed on the altars. The empire flourished in the shadow of the sacrificial knife. It was a civilization of incredible complexity, of deep spirituality and brutal warfare. They built floating gardens that fed the city. They created colonizers of astronomical precision. They composed poems of moving beauty about the transience of life, and they killed on a scale that filled other peoples with horror. This was Tenochtitlan, the city of the warlike sun god, a metropolis built on a lake of tears and blood. Its rise had been meteoric. Its fate would be just as dramatic. The gods they had nourished with such devotion would, in the end, prove powerless. A new power came across the Eastern Sea, a power that did not fear the sun and that understood blood in another way. The foundations of this great city were already trembling, although its inhabitants did not yet know it. The era of the 5th sun was leaning toward its end. The story of its downfall is a story of courage, betrayal, greed, and the collision of 2 worlds that could not have been more different. But before the eagle fell, It had risen higher than any other in this world. It had begun from a mythical place, a place called Aztlan, the island in the middle of a lake from which they took their name. Their journey had been long, an odyssey that spanned generations. They had not always been rulers. They had once been a despised people, wanderers without land, mercenaries who fought for stronger masters. Their origins are wrapped in myth, told in painted books, the codices, which were later destroyed so thoroughly by the conquerors. Legend says that they left Aztlan, the place of whiteness, at the command of their tribal god Huitzilopochtli. This god spoke to them through their priests. He promised them a land. He promised them greatness. He gave them a sign to seek. They were to settle where they saw an eagle sitting on a cactus and devouring a snake. For hundreds of years, they moved through the deserts and mountains of the north. They were the Chichimecs, the dog people, the barbarians. They came into the Valley of Mexico, a fertile high basin already inhabited by many peoples. Powerful city-states such as Azcapotzalco and Culhuacan ruled the land around the Great Lake Texcoco. The Mexica were newcomers, unwanted and poor. They were mocked, and they were used as mercenaries. They were allowed to settle in the swamps of Tizapan, a place infested with snakes. The lords of Culhuacan hoped that the snakes would destroy the intruders. But the Mexica roasted the snakes and ate them. They were tough, and they were desperate. They served the Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco, the dominant power in the valley at that time. They fought in their wars and learned the art of politics and warfare from their masters. Yet they never forgot the promise of their god. One day, so the founding legend says, their scouts saw the sign. In the middle of the swampy Lake Texcoco, on a small rocky island, a mighty eagle sat on a nopal cactus. It held a snake in its talons. This was the place. Huitzilopochtli had kept his word. Here, in the middle of hostile territory, surrounded by water and reeds, they began to build their city. The founding date is mythically connected with the year 1 reed, and historically Tenochtitlan is usually dated to around 1325. It was an impossible place. There was no farmland, no stone, no timber. Everything had to be brought from the mainland, either by trade or through tribute. But the Mexica were masters of adaptation. They learned to use the lake to their advantage. They developed the chinampas, the floating gardens. They were artificial islands built from layers of reeds, mud, and plant remains, anchored into the shallow lake bed. These chinampas were incredibly fertile. They could produce several harvests a year. They became the backbone of the city's food supply. While they were stamping their city out of the water, they also built their society. From the beginning, it was shaped by militarism. Every man was, first of all, a warrior. Society was organized into kalpuli, clans or neighborhoods that held land in common and provided their own warrior groups. At the top stood the Tlatoani, the speaker, the ruler. The first legendary ruler was Acamapictli. Under him and his successors, Tenochtitlan grew. The Mexica remained vassals of the Tepanecs, paid tribute, and fought their wars. Yet their ambition grew with their strength. The turning point came under the ruler Itzcoatl. He was a brilliant strategist and a ruthless politician. Around him gathered a new elite that no longer wanted to serve. Itzcoatl formed an alliance with two other dissatisfied city-states, Texcoco, a center of learning, and Tacuba, also known as Tlacopan, a smaller Tepanec city. Together, this triple alliance was strong enough to challenge the hegemon Azcapotzalco. The war was brutal. It ended with the complete destruction of Azcapotzalco. Tepanec rule was broken. The Triple Alliance was now the new power in the Valley of Mexico. Tenochtitlan, led by Itzcoatl, quickly became the dominant force within this alliance. They divided the tribute of the conquered territories. 5 parts were agreed upon. 2 parts went to Tenochtitlan, 2 parts went to Texcoco, and only 1 part went to Tacuba. The Aztec Empire was born. It was not an empire in the European sense, not a continuous territory administered directly. It was a hegemonic empire based on tribute. Itzcoatl and his powerful nephew and advisor Tlacaelel now began to rewrite history. Tlacaelel, the Cihuacuatl, was one of the most influential figures in Mexica history. He was the architect of imperial ideology. He ordered the burning of the old codices, the history books of conquered peoples, and even the records of their own humble past. A new history was written. It was a history in which the Mexica were the chosen people of Huitzilopochtli. It was a history in which their god was the most powerful of all gods. This new ideology placed war at the center of existence. War no longer served only territorial expansion or economic profit. War now served a higher cosmic purpose. It served to obtain the captives needed for sacrifice. Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, was now inseparably connected with the fate of the people. The warrior society was formalized. There were 2 prestigious warrior orders, the Eagle Warriors and the Jaguar Warriors. Social advancement for a commoner was possible almost only through military bravery. A man who took a captive gained prestige. A man who captured 4 or 5 prisoners could rise into the ranks of the nobility. Courage on the battlefield was rewarded. Cowardice was punished without mercy. Tenochtitlan was now no longer merely a city. It was the center of an expanding universe, the heart of an empire that had grown from humble beginnings in a swamp into a tremendous power. The foundations of mud had been built over with stone, and that stone now thirsted for the blood of the world. The gods had spoken, and the Mexica had obeyed. Their world was a mirror of their faith. The universe of the Aztecs was a complex structure of divine forces, cosmic cycles, and deeply rooted duality. Their religion was polytheistic. Hundreds of gods and goddesses filled their pantheon, each representing an aspect of nature or human life. At the top of this pantheon, however, stood a few powerful deities who guided the fate of the empire. The most important among them was Huitzilopochtli. He was the tribal god of the Mexica, the god who had led them out of Aztlan. He was the god of the midday sun, the blue hummingbird. He was the god of war. He was the god who was reborn every day in order to fight the darkness. To endure this struggle, he required constant nourishment in the form of human blood and hearts. Up. Without this nourishment, according to the belief, the sun would go out and the world would sink into eternal darkness. Huitzilopochtli's fate was the fate of the Aztecs. His temple on the Templo Mayor was the bloodiest place in the empire. Beside him stood the shrine of Tlaloc. Tlaloc was a much older god, worshipped by many peoples in the High Valley, long before the arrival of the Mexica. He was the god of rain, thunder, and fertility. He could bring blessing in the form of life-giving water. But he could also send destruction through droughts, floods, or storms. Tlaloc was unpredictable. To appease him, sacrifices were also offered, often children, whose tears were considered a symbol of rain. The duality of these two gods on the great temple was of central importance. Huitzilopochtli represented fire, war, and the imperial power of the Aztecs. Tlaloc represented water, agriculture, and the ancient traditions of the valley. Together they symbolized the concept of Atl Tlachinoli, burned water, the Aztec symbol of sacred war. Another central figure was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. He was a god of wind, wisdom, priests, and creation. He was often the opposite of the bloodthirsty Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, a god of night, sorcery, and fate. The myths told of a struggle between Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca that led to Quetzalcoatl's exile. He was said to have sailed east across the sea, with the promise that he would one day return. This promise would later play a fatal role. Aztec cosmology was based on the idea of world cycles. They believed that the universe had already passed through 4 ages, or suns, all of which had ended in catastrophe. The first sun had been destroyed by jaguars. The second sun had been destroyed by winds. The third sun ended in a rain of fire. The fourth sun drowned in a great flood. The Mexica lived in the era of the fifth sun, the sun of movement. This world, they believed, was also doomed to perish. It would be destroyed by earthquakes. The task of the Mexica, the sacred mission assigned to them by Huitzilopochtli, was to delay this inevitable end as long as possible. They could do this only by feeding the sun with the precious water of human sacrifice. This worldview penetrated every aspect of society. Time itself was sacred. The Aztecs had 2 calendars that ran in parallel. One was the Tonalpohualli, a sacred ritual calendar of 260 days. It was used for divination and for determining destinies. The other was the Xiuhpohualli, a solar calendar of 365 days that regulated the agricultural cycle and the civic festivals. Every 52 years, the beginnings of both calendars coincided and formed a kind of century. This period was marked by great fear. The Aztecs feared that the world could end at the close of such a cycle. They celebrated the new fire ceremony. All fires in the empire were extinguished. Priests climbed a mountain near Tenochtitlan and waited to see whether the stars continued on their course. If they did, a new fire was kindled on the chest of a sacrificed warrior. From this fire, torches were carried throughout the empire to relight the hearths. The world had been saved for another 52 years. This religion was not a private matter. It was a public spectacle of the state. Religious life was organized by a large and complex priestly caste. The priests were not only theologians, but also astronomers, mathematicians, teachers, and political advisors. They interpreted the wishes of the gods, read the omens, and set the dates for festivals and wars. The temples were not only places of worship, they were also observatories, schools, and treasuries. They were centers of power, both spiritual and worldly. The gods were everywhere. They were in the earth, in maize, in water, and in obsidian. They demanded constant attention and tireless sacrifice. This devotion gave the Aztecs an unshakable sense of destiny. They were the people who kept the world in balance. This belief gave them the strength to conquer an empire. But it also gave them a fatal worldview that multiplied their enemies and limited their ability to respond to threats they had not foreseen. The gods who had created them were demanding, and the price of their favor was immeasurably high. Human sacrifice was the pivot point of Aztec state religion and society. It was the mechanism through which the cosmos was kept in balance. The gods were nourished, and imperial power was displayed. For the peoples of Europe, it was the very image of barbarism, proof of devil worship. For the Mexica, it was a sacred obligation, the repayment of the divine debt. The gods had given their own blood to create humanity. Humanity owed them its own blood in return. The act of sacrifice was not arbitrary. It was deeply ritualized and charged with complex symbolism. There were many different kinds of sacrifice offered to different gods at different times. The most common and dramatic form was sacrifice by the staring out of the heart, reserved above all for Huitzilopochtli. The victims were usually prisoners of war. This connected religion inseparably with the militarism of the state. Wars were fought not only to conquer territories and collect tribute. They were also fought to obtain victims for the temples. There was even an institutionalized form of ritual war, the Xochitl, the Flower Wars. These wars were fought between the Triple Alliance and certain enemy city-states, especially Tlaxcala. The official purpose of these wars was not conquest, but the mutual taking of captives for sacrificial rituals. It was a sacred battle in which death on the battlefield or on the sacrificial stone was considered the most honorable path to the afterlife. A warrior who fell in combat or was sacrificed went directly to the House of the Sun to accompany Huitzilopochtli on his daily path across the sky. After 4 years, their souls returned to earth as hummingbirds or butterflies. This glorification of sacrificial death created a fearless warrior caste. The ritual itself was a precise spectacle. The captive, who had often been treated honorably for months and honored as the embodiment of the god himself, was led to the temple. He climbed the steep steps of the pyramid. At the top, he was thrown onto the Tenochtitlan, the sacrificial stone. The tearing out of the heart was symbolic. The heart, the Teolia, was considered the seat of consciousness and life force. It was offered to the gods in an eagle vessel, the Quetzalcoatl. The lifeless body was pushed down the steps, where it was divided by priests or warriors. Parts of the body were sometimes ritually eaten. This cannibalism was not an act of nutrition, but a sacred sacrament, an act of communion with the deity to whom the sacrifice had been offered. There were also other forms of sacrifice. Victims for Tlaloc, the rain god, were often children who were drowned at sacred mountains or shut inside caves. Their tears were considered favorable for rain. Victims for Xipe-Totec, the god of renewal and agriculture, were flayed. The priests wore the victim's skin for 20 days as a symbol of the new vegetation covering the old, dry earth. There were also gladiatorial sacrifices. An especially brave prisoner could be given the chance to fight for his life. He was tied to a large round stone and given a mock weapon. Then he had to face several fully armed eagle or jaguar warriors. It was a fight he could not possibly win, but his courage in the face of certain death honored the gods. The sheer number of victims is disputed among historians. Spanish chroniclers spoke of tens of thousands sacrificed on special occasions, such as the dedication of the Templo Mayor. Although these numbers may have been exaggerated to justify the brutality of conquest, archaeological evidence, such as the huge skull racks, the Tzompantli, indicates that sacrifices took place on a large scale. One such skull rack found in Tenochtitlan contained thousands of skulls. The effects of this practice on society were profound. It created a constant need for war and captives. It cemented the power of the priests and the warrior elite. It also served as a powerful instrument of terror and state control. Subject peoples were forced to witness the sacrifices, often of their own countrymen. It was an unmistakable message about the power of Tenochtitlan and the omnipotence of its gods. The empire was built on blood. But this dependence on sacrifice also made the system fragile. The hatred of the conquered peoples, who had to supply the constant stream of tribute and victims, grew steadily. When the Spaniards arrived, they found an empire being eaten from within by resentment. Many indigenous peoples saw the newcomers not as conquerors, but as liberators from the bloody tyranny of the Mexica. Human sacrifice was the engine that drove the Aztec universe, but it was also the fuel for the fire that would eventually consume the empire. It was a practice born from a deep belief in the preservation of the world, but in the end, it helped bring about its destruction. Daily life in Tenochtitlan was as structured and complex as the religion of the empire. The city itself was a marvel of engineering and urban planning. It was connected to the mainland by three great, broad causeways which could serve as defensive structures when necessary. Aqueducts brought fresh drinking water from the springs near the hill of Chapultepec into the city. The city was divided into 4 large quarters, or campan, which extended outward from the central temple precinct. These quarters were further divided into smaller kalpuli neighborhood clans that organized social and economic life. Each kalpuli had its own temples, markets, and schools. Society was strictly hierarchical. At the top stood the Tlatoani, the great speaker, the emperor. He was chosen from the royal line and ruled as an absolute monarch, regarded as the representative of the gods on earth. Moctezuma II, the ruler who encountered the Spaniards, lived in a palace of unimaginable splendor, with gardens, a zoo, and hundreds of servants. Beneath him stood the nobility, the pipiltin. They were the high officials, military leaders, judges, and chief priests. Noble status was usually hereditary, but, as already mentioned, deserving commoners could also rise into the nobility, mostly through military success. The great majority of the population were the Masihualtan, the commoners. They were farmers, craftsmen, fishermen, and ordinary soldiers. They did not own land as individuals, but received rights to use land from the kalpuli, which they had to cultivate and defend in return. They paid tribute to the state and to the nobility, both in goods and in labor service, such as building temples or causeways. A special class was formed by the Pacteca, the long-distance traders. They were a powerful guild that stood outside the normal social hierarchy. They undertook long expeditions into distant regions, often as far as the borders of present-day Guatemala. They traded in luxury goods such as jade, quetzal feathers, cacao, and animal skins. But they also served the Tlatoani as spies, collecting information about the wealth and military strength of other peoples. At the bottom of society stood the slaves, the Tlacatan. Slavery among the Aztecs, however, was different from slavery in the European understanding. It was not a racial or hereditary institution. People could become slaves through war captivity as punishment for crimes, or by selling themselves or their children in times of economic need. Slaves could own property, marry, and even buy their own freedom. the heart of urban life, was the market. The largest market was held in the sister city of Tlatelolco. Spanish chroniclers, who saw it, were overwhelmed by its size and order. Tens of thousands of people gathered there every day. Everything produced in the empire could be found there. There were sections for foods such as maize, beans, chili, turkeys, and dogs bred for meat. There were sections for pottery, textiles, tools made of obsidian and stone, medicinal herbs, and luxury goods. Trade was based on barter. Cacao beans, cotton cloaks, and small copper axes served as standardized units of currency. Judges supervised the market to prevent fraud and to keep prices fair. Education was central to Aztec society and was also divided into two paths. Every Calpulli maintained two kinds of schools. The Telpocalli, the house of youth, was intended for the children of commoners. Here the focus was on practical skills, history, religious tradition, and above all military training. Boys learned to use weapons such as the atalol, the spear thrower, and the makuahutl, the fearsome obsidian sword. The Kalmakak was the school for the children of the nobility and for those commoners destined for the priesthood. Education there was more intellectually and spiritually demanding. The students learned to read and write the pictographic and ideographic script of the Aztecs. They studied astronomy, mathematics, theology, law, and government. Discipline in both schools was extremely strict. Aztec culture also produced remarkable scientific and artistic achievements. Their astronomers observed the stars with great accuracy and developed the complex calendar systems already mentioned. The sunstone, often incorrectly called the calendar stone, is a monumental testimony to their cosmological understanding. Their architects and engineers built a metropolis on a lake, an achievement that astonished even experienced Europeans. Art was deeply religious. Sculpture was often monumental and terrifying, as in the massive statue of the goddess Coatlicue, the mother of the gods. But there was also a flourishing tradition of featherwork, in which colorful feathers were made into elaborate mosaics, shields, and headdresses. Poetry, often composed by rulers such as Nezahualcóyotl of Texcoco, was a highly respected medium. It often dealt with the beauty of nature, the honor of war, and the ever-present transience of life on earth. Life in Tenochtitlan was a life of contrasts. It was shaped by strict social order and deep faith, by hard work and magnificent festivals, by the beauty of the floating gardens and the brutality of the sacrificial stone. It was a civilization at its absolute height, self-confident and powerful. It was the center of its universe. Military expansion was the engine of the Aztec state. After the victory over Azcapotzalco and the founding of the Triple Alliance, the Mexica, under rulers such as Itzcoatl, Moctezuma I, and Ahuitzotl, began an aggressive policy of expansion. The goal was not the complete annexation of territories in the European style. The goal was the subjugation of other city-states, the Altepetls, and their integration into a vast tribute system. When a city was conquered, it was forced to recognize the supremacy of Tenochtitlan, to honor Huitzilopochtli as a supreme god, and above all to pay tribute regularly. Tribute was the economic lifeblood of the empire. It flowed into the treasuries of Tenochtitlan and was used to feed the growing urban population, to pay priests and officials, and to finance further wars. The tribute lists preserved in codices, such as the Codex Mendoza, show the immense variety of goods demanded. They ranged from basic foods such as maize and beans, to raw materials such as cotton and rubber, to luxury goods such as jade, gold, colorful feathers, and jaguar bones. Even living animals such as eagles were demanded. Entire regions were forced to deliver thousands of cotton cloaks, which served as a form of currency. Aztec warfare was highly ritualized, but still brutally effective. The army consisted of the common units of the Calpulli and the elite orders of the Eagle and Jaguar warriors. Weapons were designed for close combat and wounding, not necessarily for immediate killing. The primary goal on the battlefield was to take captives. A warrior who killed an enemy received less honor than one who captured him alive. The macuahutl, the obsidian-edged club, was a terrifying weapon. It consisted of a wooden core into which razor-sharp obsidian blades were set. It could cut off limbs, but it was also fragile. Spear throwers, known as atlatls, gave spears far greater range and penetrating power than throwing by hand. Shields were made of wood and decorated with feathers. Armor consisted of padded cotton soaked in salt water, which was surprisingly resistant to arrows and spears. Warfare often began with a formal declaration of war. Messengers were sent to demand submission. If the city refused, war was declared. Battles were often large-arranged confrontations on open fields. They began with loud war cries, the sound of drums, and conch-shell trumpets. Elite warriors sought direct combat with enemy leaders. If the enemy line was broken or its leader fell, the army often dissolved. The siege of a city was difficult because the Aztecs did not possess siege machines in the style of the Old World. When a city was taken, a massacre often followed, although it was in the interest of the Aztecs to leave the infrastructure and population intact so that tribute could be collected. The most important booty, however, was captives. They were brought to Tenochtitlan to be sacrificed in the great temple ceremonies. This practice served a double purpose. It fulfilled the religious duty of feeding the gods, and it served as merciless psychological warfare. Subject peoples were terrorized by the sight of the fate of their bravest warriors. The empire expanded rapidly. Under Moctezuma I, it reached the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. Under Ahuitzotl, one of the most aggressive rulers, the empire pushed southward into the Soconusco region in order to gain control of the valuable cacao plantations. But the empire was not a monolithic block. It was a patchwork of subject peoples who hated Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs often ruled indirectly. They left local rulers in office as long as tribute was paid on time. However, they also installed imperial tribute collectors, who were often arrogant and demanding, and who stirred local resentment. Constant rebellions were the order of the day. An Aztec army had to be constantly on the move to suppress uprisings and punish disobedient vassals. Some peoples successfully resisted Aztec rule. The Tlaxcans, enclosed in the highlands east of Tenochtitlan, were the bitterest enemies of the Aztecs. They were never conquered and fought the continual flower wars against the Triple Alliance. The Tarascans in the west, in present-day Michoacán, also resisted Aztec expansion. They possessed metal weapons, especially bronze, which gave them a technological advantage. When Moctezuma II ascended the throne, he inherited a vast but unstable empire. He tried to centralize control and strengthen the power of the Mexica. He replaced local rulers with Aztec governors. This policy increased the efficiency of tribute collection, but it also increased the hatred of the provinces. The system depended on constant expansion and a constant flow of victims. It was a war machine that powered itself. But this machine had created powerful internal enemies. The foundation of the empire was brittle. It was only waiting for an external shock to collapse. And that shock would soon come across the Eastern Sea. In the years immediately before the arrival of the Europeans, the Aztec Empire was troubled by a series of disturbing omens. A comet appeared in broad daylight. The temple of Huitzilopochtli caught fire in an unexplained way. Lake Texcoco boiled and flooded parts of the city. A wailing woman's voice was heard at night, crying for her children. For Moctezuma Tuke, these were signs of a coming catastrophe. His priests and diviners could not interpret them to his satisfaction. Fear of the end of the fifth sun was everywhere. Then reports came from the Gulf of Mexico. Messengers brought news of floating mountains that had appeared on the sea. Strange men had climbed out of them. Their skin was as white as lime. They wore beards. They were dressed in shining metal. They rode on enormous deer, animals that provoked fear and wonder, and they carried weapons that hurled thunder and lightning. This was the year 1 read in the Aztec calendar. This date was of decisive importance. It was the date associated in later accounts with the return of the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, to reclaim his realm. Moctezuma was a deeply religious man, trapped in the prophecies of his own culture. He faced a paralyzing question. Were these arrivals gods or human beings? The leader of these strangers was Hernan Cortes. He was an ambitious, ruthless, and brilliant Spanish conquistador who had departed from Cuba without proper final approval, in search of gold, glory, and souls to win for Christianity. He sailed from Cuba in February 1519 with 11 ships, 508 soldiers, around 100 sailors, and 16 horses. Cortes quickly recognized the internal divisions of the land he had entered. The first peoples he encountered, including the Totonacs, complained bitterly about Mexica tyranny. Cortes offered them liberation in exchange for loyalty to Spain. Here began the decisive strategy of the Spaniards. They would not conquer the empire alone. They would overthrow it with the help of the empire's own oppressed peoples. The technological differences were striking. The Spaniards possessed steel. They had swords, lances, helmets, and breastplates that were almost invulnerable to the obsidian weapons of the Aztecs. The Aztecs had padded cotton armor, effective against their own weapons, but useless against steel blades. The Spaniards had crossbows and arquebuses, early firearms. These were slow to load and inaccurate, but their psychological effect was devastating. The thunder and smoke made them appear like tools of the gods. The cannons could cause massive destruction and break through the dense formations of Aztec warriors. And then there were the horses. The peoples of Mesoamerica knew no large draft or riding animals. A man on a horse seemed like a frightening supernatural creature, a centaur from myth. Yet the deadless weapon the Spaniards brought with them was invisible. It was disease, smallpox, measles, influenza. The peoples of the New World had lived in isolation for thousands of years. They had no immunity to Eurasian epidemics. These diseases would soon sweep through the population like wildfire and kill more people than all the battles combined. Cortes's march inland was a masterpiece of political manipulation and military boldness. His decisive move was the alliance with Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans, the eternal enemies of the Aztecs, at first opposed the Spaniards in a series of fierce battles. They realized that the Spaniards were not gods, because they bled and died. But after their defeat, they saw in Cortes the ultimate weapon against their hated neighbors in Tenochtitlan. They formed an alliance that placed tens of thousands of elite soldiers at the Spaniards' disposal. Without the Tlaxcalans, the conquest would have been impossible. Meanwhile, Moctezuma wavered between hospitality and aggression. He sent envoys with splendid gifts of gold, hoping the strangers would be satisfied and turn back. But the gold had the opposite effect. It inflamed the greed of the conquistadors and confirmed their boldest dreams of a legendary land of riches. In Cholula, a sacred city loyal to Tenochtitlan, the Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies carried out a preventive massacre. They had heard of a conspiracy and struck first. Thousands of unarmed nobles and citizens were cut down in the central square. News of this slaughter spread terror through the entire empire and paralyzed Aztec resistance. Finally, the Spaniards reached Tenochtitlan. They marched into the city over one of the great causeways. The Spaniards were speechless at what they saw: the huge city on the water, the magnificent buildings, the orderly markets, the floating gardens. It seemed to them like a dream, like an enchanted city from the romances of chivalry. Moctezuma received Cortes at the edge of the city. It was a meeting of two worlds. The Aztec emperor was dressed in feathers and jade, barefoot on mats strewn with flowers. The Spanish captain wore steel armor. Moctezuma lodged the Spaniards as guests in one of his father's palaces. He treated them honorably, perhaps still unsure whether they were of divine origin, or perhaps in an attempt to keep them under control. Cortes quickly realized that he was sitting in a trap. He and his few hundred men were on an island, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of Aztec warriors. He resorted to a desperate measure. He took Moctezuma hostage in his own palace. He forced the emperor to rule the empire through Spanish commands. The Spaniards began to demand gold. They melted down the irreplaceable works of Aztec art into bars. They banned public human sacrifices and placed Christian images in the temples. Tension in the city grew. The Aztec population was outraged by the desecration of their gods and the humiliation of their ruler. Contact had been made, but it had not been an exchange. It was an invasion. The fragile coexistence in Tenochtitlan broke apart when Cortes had to leave the city to confront a Spanish punitive expedition coast that had been sent to arrest him for disobeying orders. He left part of his men under the command of the impulsive Pedro de Alvarado. While Cortes was absent, the Aztecs celebrated the important festival of Toxcatl in honor of Huitzilopochtli. Thousands of the best warriors and nobles of the city gathered unarmed in the great temple precinct to dance. Alvarado, fearing rebellion or driven simply by greed, saw an opportunity. He ordered his men to close the gates of the temple precinct and carry out a massacre. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of the Aztec elite were slaughtered. This act of betrayal was the spark that triggered open war. When Cortes returned after a victory on the coast, he found Tenochtitlan in revolt. The population had taken up arms. The Spaniards were besieged inside their palace. The bridges on the causeways had been destroyed or razed. Cortes forced Moctezuma to climb onto the roof of the palace to calm his people. But the people no longer listened to their ruler. They saw him as a traitor and a puppet of the Spaniards. Moctezuma was struck by a hail of stones and spears. He died a few days later, either from his wounds or, as some indigenous accounts suggest, after being killed by the Spaniards. With Moctezuma's death, every hope of a negotiated solution was gone. The Spaniards were trapped, and their supplies were running out. They decided to attempt a night escape. This night became known as La Noche Triste, the Sad Night. The Spaniards tried to flee along one of the causeways, weighed down with the gold they had stolen. They were discovered. Aztec warriors attacked from every side, on foot along the causeway, and from the water in thousands of canoes. The retreat became a catastrophe. The causeway was broken. Soldiers, horses, and Tlaxcalan allies fell into the water. Those heavily loaded with gold drowned immediately. Hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of their indigenous allies were killed or captured. The captives were immediately taken to the Templo Mayor and sacrificed to Huitzilopochtli, while their comrades watched from the shore. Cortes himself barely escaped. He reached the mainland, where, according to tradition, he sat beneath a tree and wept over the loss of his men and his fortune. The Aztec Empire had struck back and had dealt the invaders a crushing blow. It seemed as if the threat had been averted. A new and far more aggressive Tlatoani was chosen, Cuitlahuac, an experienced warrior. But the Spaniards were not defeated. They withdrew to Tlaxcala, the territory of their loyal allies. There they were received, cared for, and rearmed. The Tlaxcalans maintained their alliance. They saw this as the final opportunity to destroy their mortal enemies. And while the Spaniards gathered their strength, the invisible ally began its work. A slave in Cortes's force carried smallpox. The disease broke out in Tenochtitlan. The Mexica had no defenses against it. The plague raged through the densely populated city. Tens of thousands died. Entire families were wiped out. The streets were covered with bodies. Social order collapsed. Cuitlahuac, the victorious emperor, died of smallpox after only about 80 days of rule. The disease demoralized the Aztecs. Their gods seemed powerless against this new plague. In Cuitlahuac's place came his young relative Cuauhtémoc, the descending eagle. He was a determined and courageous leader who swore to defend the city to the last man. He took over a city already marked by disease and despair. Meanwhile, Cortes prepared the final blow. He would not take the city by a frontal assault. He would besiege it and starve it. He used the labor of his Tlaxcalan allies to build 13 special ships, brigantines, in separate parts. These ships were carried over the mountains to Lake Texcoco and assembled there. They were small but armed with cannons. They gave the Spaniards control over the lake, the lifeline of Tenochtitlan. The brigantines could destroy the thousands of Aztec canoes and cut off the city's supply of food and water. In the spring of 1521, the siege of Tenochtitlan began. The Spaniards and their tens of thousands of indigenous allies attacked the city from 3 sides along the causeways. The brigantines patrolled the lake and cut the aqueducts. The battle for Tenochtitlan was one of the most brutal in the history of the Americas. It lasted almost 3 months, from May 22 to August 13, 1521. The Aztecs fought with the strength of desperation. They defended every causeway, every canal, every house. The Spaniards advanced only slowly. What they captured during the day, they often had to abandon at night, or the Aztecs captured it again. The fighting was relentless. Cortes realized that he could take the city only by systematically destroying it. House by house, he ordered the buildings torn down and the canals filled in to create open ground for his cavalry and cannon. The magnificent metropolis was reduced to rubble and ashes. Inside the city, apocalyptic conditions prevailed. Smallpox continued to rage. There was no clean water. Supplies were exhausted. People began to starve. They ate bark, roots, leather, and even clay. Despite hunger and disease, the warriors under Cuauhtémoc continued to fight. They launched desperate counterattacks. Once they even managed to capture a group of Spaniards. They sacrificed them on the remaining temples in sight of their comrades